Hey guys, EC Network here, coming at you with another video. So, does anybody remember a show called Zoids on Cartoon Network back in the early 2000s? I was a big fan of Zoids, and honestly, everybody I talked to, no one really knows what Zoids is. Basically, if you don't know already, the franchise originated in Japan in the 80s, where they were making these model kits where you build mechs based on animals. Basically, think of Gundams, but instead of being giant robots, they're giant robot animals. And so, like I said before, the original run of Zoids was in the 80s. It started actually in the early 80s and went all the way until 1990, and then it was discontinued. Zoids disappeared until in 1999 they decided, why don't we revive Zoids, but with a TV show this time? So the Zoids Chaotic Century anime premiered in 1999 and made its way over to Cartoon Network in the early 2000s. And basically, the show was taking these Zoids, these mech animal creatures, and using them as war machines. There were different factions fighting against each other, and throughout the whole run of the show, basically, different characters would pilot these Zoids and they would fight each other. Essentially, the pilots would go inside of the cockpit of the Zoid, which was basically part of its head, and they would use them as machines to fight. Later on, Zoids New Century premiered on Cartoon Network, which was pretty much the same concept, but instead of it being warring times, it was now peaceful times. So instead of Zoids being used to fight against, a war against different factions, they were used in teams of 3 or 4, and they were basically used as a sport now, as a competition. And that show was only on for a year in 2001. Then the next iteration of Zoids was Zoids Fusers, which was essentially similar concept to Zoids New Century, where the Zoids would be used for sports, but instead of it being out in the open team-based, it was in an arena with spectators watching. And the main gimmick of this new series was that your Zoids can now fuse together. You could take one Zoid and fuse it with another. And this was actually the last show to be in the US for Zoids. It premiered in 2003 and actually ended in the same year, and after that, Zoids was gone from the US. Hasbro was the one putting out the toy line, and it disappeared. I remember at the time reruns was still on Cartoon Network, and I remember it was so hard to find Zoids in stores because the franchise was being discontinued in the US. But on the contrary, in Japan, they were continuing it with a 4th iteration in Zoids Genesis in the year 2005, and it ended in 2006. And basically, the point of the show was being in a post-apocalyptic society where the Zoids were basically being used as just war machines again. It was back to the warring times like in Chaotic Century, but that didn't really save the franchise in Japan. What happened in the US would later come to happen in Japan, with 2006 being the last year of Zoids. They stopped the show and they continued to make models in 2007 and 2008 and in 2009, but in those respective years, there were only one model each. They only made one model kit each year, and that was the end of the franchise. And yeah, Zoids kind of lives on today because the designs from the original iterations of it, being in the 80s and the early 2000s, are still being made today by a company called Kotobuyu in Japan, where they make these high-end master models, which I actually own a couple of them myself, and they're really nice. They're quite expensive, and also importing them to the US, because they're only sold in Japan, is a bit pricey, but they are really high quality. If you guys want to get into it, I would definitely recommend it. But now we fast forward to 2018, and there was a bit of teasing from Takara Tomy, who is the owner of the Zoids franchise in Japan. They have the rights to it. They were teasing that Zoids was coming back in some way, and I remember at the time I was like, oh man, that's awesome. I used to really like Zoids back in the day. I wonder what they're going to do. And they introduced something called Zoids Wild, and it took a little bit of departure from the Zoids that I grew up with. Instead of them being machines that people would pilot, basically like a car or a plane or any other machinery we know in the real world, instead of that, they were basically just animals that they would ride on their backs. They weren't piloting them anymore. They were just riding them and I guess commanding them through that way, which, I wasn't as big as a fan of that. The designs, as you can see, I'm putting some up on screen now. The designs aren't bad necessarily, but I just don't think they're as good as the designs that I grew up with and the designs that were introduced in the 80s. Like, for example, a lot of the Zoids that were in the original anime in the early 2000s, they were designed in the 80s, and quite frankly, those designs from the 80s still hold up today and still look really cool, but the thing is I feel like they're better than the reboot Zoids Wild line. I just don't like the vibe I'm getting from Zoids Wild. It's not bad, but it's just not for me. Anyways, Zoids Wild anime premiered in 2018 and it ended in 2019, and it never came to the US until last fall, which I'll get into that a little bit later. But the next Zoids show was Zoids Wild Zero, which premiered in 2019 and ended in 2020, and the toy line is producing a lot of figures during this time. There's a lot of new model kits coming out, and then all of a sudden we get the new one, which I know I'm going to butcher this name, but it's called Zoids Wild Senki. And Zoids Wild Senki is an online series that consists of 3-minute long episodes. And at this time, looking at the production line for Zoids, they really took a step back making new model kits in the year 2020, and in 2021 there's only one new model kit, which makes me think that the franchise is winding down again, which is interesting because at the same time the franchise is winding down in Japan, they're now bringing it to the US. Like I said earlier in the video, Zoids Wild is actually on Netflix, and it came out this past fall, and I just found out about this the other day because to my knowledge, I saw no advertising about this whatsoever, and there's a toy line again. Hasbro has started to produce Zoids toys again under the moniker Zoids Build Them to Battle, and apparently they also came out in the fall, and a new wave came out on March 1st of this year. So it's weird to me that Zoids seems to be coming to a conclusion in Japan, or at least they're winding down the Zoids Wild franchise, but yet now they're introducing them 3 years later in the US. So I am curious to see what is the future of this franchise. Like I said, the old Zoids are still living on with the high-end master model in Japan, but as it is right now, the old Zoids that I grew up with, those old designs, are dead in America. There is no product line producing them. There is no TV show connected to them. All we have is this new Zoids Wild show. So I'm curious, how is this going to do in America? If it's ending in Japan, then, I guess maybe their hope is by bringing it to America, maybe they can continue the franchise even further. But let me know in the comment section below if you guys remember Zoids at all, if you never heard of this franchise. Like I said before, everyone I know, speaking to them about Zoids, they've never heard about it. So yeah, I'm really curious if you guys have ever seen Zoids on Cartoon Network and you remember it back in the day. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.